My name is Poppy Harrington. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've worked as an architectural illustrator. It's a quiet profession. Most days it's just me, a drafting table, a pot of coffee, and the slow patience of lines becoming buildings. If you met me in person, you probably wouldn't remember me very long. That's not self-pity, it's just the truth. People tend to notice louder personalities first, the confident ones, the ones who fill a room with their opinions. I've always been the opposite of that. I listen more than I speak. I watch more than I react. Most people interpret that in one of two ways. Either they assume I'm shy, or they assume I'm easy. For a long time, my family believed the second one. In their version of me, I was the dependable daughter, the calm one, the one who didn't make trouble, the one who could always be asked for a little more time, a little more patience, a little more understanding. And because I rarely argued, they assumed I agreed. That misunderstanding lasted for years. The house I live in sits on a quiet street in Portland. It's not particularly large, but it has something most homes in this area don't: a finished basement apartment with its own entrance. When I bought the place 8 years ago, that basement was just a practical decision. It made the mortgage manageable. Sometimes I rented it out. Sometimes it stayed empty while I worked. It was simply part of the house. Legally speaking, though, the entire property, every floor, every room, every inch of that basement belonged to me. My family knew that, in a technical sense. But families have a way of reshaping facts into something softer, something more convenient. And eventually, my mother decided the basement had another purpose. She called it family helping family. What she meant was this: my younger brother needed a place to stay. Temporarily, of course. And somehow, without a real conversation, without permission, and without even asking me directly, he moved into my basement. At first, people hear that and assume the story will turn loud and dramatic. They expect arguments, shouting, and doors slamming. That's not what happened. In fact, almost everything that mattered in this story happened quietly. No screaming, no revenge, no big emotional explosion. Just a long series of small decisions, mine and theirs, that slowly changed the direction of everyone's lives. This isn't a story about punishing anyone. It's about what happens when someone who has always been underestimated finally stops correcting that assumption. It's about silence, the kind that people mistake for weakness until they realize it wasn't weakness at all. And by the time they understand, it's usually far too late to change anything. So that's the story I'm going to tell you today. Not as gossip, not as drama, just honestly. Because sometimes the quietest stories reveal the most about how people treat each other, and about the moment someone finally decides they're done playing the role everyone else wrote for them. Before we go any further, I'm curious about something. Have you ever had a moment where people thought they understood you, but they were completely wrong? If you asked my family to describe me, most of them would probably pause for a moment before answering. Not because they didn't know me, but because I was never the person they needed to explain. My younger brother, Ryan, was easy to describe. He was energetic, charismatic, and a little reckless in the way younger siblings sometimes are. Growing up, he was the one teachers talked about, the one relative asked about at the holidays. How's Ryan doing these days? My name rarely came first in those conversations. That didn't mean anyone disliked me. In fact, most people would say they appreciated me. I was the steady one, the calm one, the one who always has things figured out. It sounds like a compliment when you say it that way, but over time, it quietly becomes something else. It becomes an assumption. When we were kids, that role made sense. Ryan needed help with homework. I helped him. My parents needed someone to stay home while they worked late. I stayed. I didn't protest much. I didn't see a reason to. Part of that was simply my personality. I've never been someone who competes for attention. If anything, I preferred the quieter corners of a room. But another part of it came from something subtler. People reward the person who makes life easier for them. And if you become that person long enough, they stop asking whether you mind. They assume you don't. By the time we were adults, the pattern was so normal that nobody questioned it anymore. Ryan moved between jobs and apartments more times than I could count. Each time something fell apart, my mother would sigh the same way she always did. He's just figuring things out. My path looked different. I finished school, built my illustration career slowly, and saved money carefully. When I bought my house at 28, it was the first time anyone in my immediate family had owned property in decades. My mother cried when she saw it. Not because it was big or impressive, Because it meant stability. You've always been the responsible one, she told me that day, while we stood in the empty living room. At the time, I took that as love. Looking back, I realize it was also a label. Responsible people in my family didn't create problems. They solved them. The house itself reflected the way I like to live. Simple, organized, quiet. The upstairs held the main living space and my small studio where I worked. Tall windows faced the street, and in the afternoons, sunlight stretched across the drafting table where I spent most of my days drawing. The basement apartment had its own entrance through a small side gate. It wasn't luxurious, but it was comfortable. One bedroom, a small kitchen, a living area, and a bathroom. Sometimes I rented it to traveling nurses or graduate students. Sometimes it stayed empty. I liked knowing it was there, not just for the extra income, but because it represented something I had built entirely on my own. My parents had never contributed financially to the house. They couldn't have, even if they wanted to. Everything about it, the mortgage, the paperwork, the maintenance, was mine to manage. And I did, quietly. In fact, that's the word most people would use to describe how I lived my life. Quiet. I didn't post much online. I didn't host large gatherings. My work clients usually knew me only through email and occasional video calls. To the outside world, I probably looked like someone whose life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But quiet doesn't mean passive. It means observant. And if there's one habit my job has trained into me, it's noticing details other people overlook. Architectural illustrators spend hours studying tiny structural relationships, how one beam supports another, how a staircase fits into a wall, how small decisions affect the stability of an entire structure. You learn quickly that what people see on the surface is rarely the full story. Families work the same way. On the surface, my family dynamic looked simple: a caring mother, a struggling younger brother, and me, the capable daughter who always seemed to have everything under control. That version of the story was comfortable for everyone. Comfortable stories rarely get questioned, which is why, when something small finally happened that didn't fit that story, most people didn't notice it at all. But I did. And that was the moment the foundation of everything started to shift. The first moment that mattered didn't look important. In fact, if you had been sitting in the room that afternoon, you probably wouldn't have remembered it later. It was a Sunday in early spring. Portland was still carrying that soft grey light that lingers between winter and summer. I had spent the morning working on a rendering for a client, a small community library renovation, and around noon, my mother called. Her calls were rarely urgent. They usually arrived in the middle of ordinary moments, carrying small pieces of family news. So when my phone buzzed on the desk, I answered without thinking much about it. "Hi, mine." Her voice sounded distracted in the way it sometimes did when she was halfway through doing something else. "Hi, honey, are you busy?" "Just finishing a drawing," I said. "What's up?" There was a small pause, not long enough to feel strange at first, just long enough that I noticed it. "Well," she said finally, "I was talking to Ryan this morning." That alone wasn't unusual. My brother called her constantly whenever something in his life shifted, which was often, but the tone in her voice had a certain softness to it. The kind people use when they're preparing you for information rather than asking a question. That's, "He's having a little trouble with his apartment again," she continued. Again. That word barely registered at the time because it had appeared so many times before. Over the years, Ryan had moved between apartments, roommates, and short-term leases with a rhythm that felt almost seasonal. Something would fall through, something would change, and my mother would worry. I leaned back slightly in my chair, twirling the pencil between my fingers. "That's rough," I said. "Yes, well," she sighed. "These things happen." Another pause. "This one is slightly longer." Then she said something that, at the time, still didn't sound like a request. "You still have that basement space, don't you?" The question was casual, almost conversational. "Yeah," I said. "It's empty right now." "Right," she replied quickly. "That's what I thought." The conversation drifted for a few minutes after that. She asked about my work, about the weather, and about whether I had spoken to my aunt recently. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational. And when we hung up, I went back to finishing the library rendering without giving the call much more thought. If someone had asked me later that day what my mother wanted, I probably would have said something like, "Oh, she was just checking in." But there was something about that one small question that stayed with me longer than the rest of the conversation. "You still have that basement space, don't you?" It wasn't the question itself. It was the way she asked it, not curious. Certain, as if she were confirming something she already knew. I noticed it the way you notice a tiny misalignment in a drawing. A line that looks straight at first glance, but feels slightly off when you study it longer. I didn't confront it. I didn't even mention it to anyone, because nothing had technically happened yet. No one had asked me for anything. No one had crossed a boundary. Still, when I closed my sketchbook that evening and walked downstairs to check the basement apartment, something I rarely did when it was empty, I remember standing there for a moment in the quiet. The small kitchen was clean. The windows were closed. The room smelled faintly like the lemon cleaner I used after the last tenant moved out. Everything looked exactly the same, but the space felt different, like a room someone had already started talking about using. It's strange how quickly our instincts notice things our minds haven't fully processed yet. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. Ryan hadn't asked to move in. My mother hadn't asked either. All that had happened was a single question. But sometimes the first shift in a story isn't an event. It's a tone. And that small, almost invisible change was the first cut in something that would slowly become impossible to ignore. For a few weeks after that phone call, nothing happened. Life continued exactly the way it always had. I worked during the day, sending finished renderings to clients and quietly building the kind of steady freelance career that doesn't attract much attention but pays the bills reliably. In the evenings, I cooked simple dinners, watered the small herb plants on the kitchen windowsill, and sometimes sat with my sketchbook long after the light outside had faded. The basement apartment remained empty. If the earlier conversation with my mother had meant anything, no one mentioned it again. At least not directly. Instead, the subject began appearing in smaller, more casual ways. The first time was during a family dinner about 2 weeks later. My parents had driven into the city to meet me at a small Italian restaurant we sometimes visited when they came to Portland. Ryan arrived late, as usual. He slid into the booth beside my mother with the restless energy he always carried, apologizing quickly while scrolling through something on his phone. "Traffic was insane," he said. My father waved it off. My mother asked him if he had eaten that day. I listened quietly, the way I usually did. Halfway through the meal, Ryan mentioned something about apartment prices increasing again. "They're ridiculous right now," he said, shaking his head. "Every place I look at wants double what it should." My mother nodded sympathetically. "It's so unfair for young people trying to get started." Ryan shrugged, but the gesture carried a familiar frustration. "I might have to stay with friends for a while if this lease thing falls through." Then my mother said something that shifted the conversation in a subtle way. "Well," she said lightly, turning toward me, "Poppy has that whole basement space, don't you?" The sentence landed gently, almost like a joke. Everyone looked at me for a second. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, just one of those small pauses that happen naturally in conversation. "Yeah," I said. Ryan glanced at me, then back at his plate. "That must be nice," he said with a small laugh. "Extra space like that?" I smiled slightly. "It's useful sometimes." And then the conversation moved on. No one asked if he could stay there. No one made a direct request. But something had quietly changed. The basement apartment had entered the family conversation. After that dinner, similar comments appeared more often. Sometimes it was my mother on the phone. "It's such a blessing you have that extra space." Other times, it was Ryan mentioning how difficult it was to find affordable housing. Each comment on its own sounded harmless. None of them required a response. None of them crossed a clear boundary. But together they created a strange new assumption, like a story slowly forming around a fact. In that story, the basement apartment wasn't simply part of my house anymore. It was available for something or someone. The interesting part is that I never corrected that assumption. Not because I agreed with it, but because correcting it would have required something I wasn't sure anyone was ready for yet. A direct conversation. And my family had never been very good at those. Instead, they operated through implication, through hints, through statements that sounded casual, but carried quiet expectations underneath. At the time, I told myself I was imagining it. Families say things all the time without meaning anything serious by them. Maybe my mother was simply talking. Maybe Ryan was just venting about rent prices. Still, the pattern continued. And every time it did, I noticed the same thing. No one ever asked. They simply talked as if the possibility already existed. And the strange part was that my silence, which I had always thought of as neutral, began to function like agreement. Not intentionally, but gradually. The more I didn't respond, the more natural the assumption became. Until eventually, The idea stopped sounding hypothetical altogether. And by the time that happened, the decision had already been made. Just not by me. There's a moment in many families when roles stop being temporary and quietly become permanent. No one announces it. There's no official conversation. But over time, everyone begins to behave as if certain things are simply the way they are. By the time we reached our 30s, those roles were firmly in place. Ryan was the one who was still finding his path. My parents treated his mistakes like temporary detours, frustrating, sometimes expensive, but understandable. And I was the one who had everything handled, the one who didn't need help, the one who could provide help. It wasn't malicious. I want to be clear about that. My parents loved both of us. But love doesn't always come with awareness. Sometimes it comes with expectations that slowly grow around a person until they become invisible. And I had become the reliable one, the person who solved problems quietly, the person who didn't make situations harder. For years, I played that role without thinking much about it. When Ryan needed advice about a job interview, he called me. When my parents struggled with paperwork or online forms, I handled them. When someone needed a ride from the airport or help moving furniture, I showed up. Not because anyone forced me to, because it seemed easier than saying no. Saying yes keeps things smooth. And smooth families feel like healthy families, at least on the surface. Looking back, I can see how that pattern shaped the way everyone saw my house. To them, it wasn't just a place I lived. It was proof that I had more than I needed. More space, more stability, more resources. The basement apartment became part of that perception. Whenever my parents visited, my mother would walk past the basement door and say things like, "You're so lucky to have this extra area." Or sometimes, "It must be nice knowing you always have room if someone needs it." The first few times she said it, I didn't think much about it. But the phrasing began to repeat itself. Always have room. If someone needs it. The interesting thing about language is that it can assign responsibility without directly stating it. If someone needs it, that someone was never defined. But we all knew who it would be. Ryan's housing situation continued to drift the way it always had. Short leases, roommates who moved away, apartments that became too expensive. Each time something fell apart, my mother would describe the situation with the same tone of concern. "Things are just unstable for him right now." And each time, the basement apartment would appear somewhere in the conversation. Not as a request, as a possibility. Eventually, even Ryan started referring to it casually. One evening during a phone call, he said something that made the patterns suddenly clearer. I mean, worst case scenario, I could always crash in your basement for a bit. But he said it jokingly, light, the kind of comment people make while laughing. I remember sitting at my desk, staring at the window while he said it. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I asked a simple question. "What makes you think that?" There was a short pause on the other end of the phone. Then he laughed again. "Relax, I'm kidding." Maybe he was. Maybe he wasn't. But what mattered wasn't the joke. It was the assumption underneath it. Somewhere along the way, my house had stopped being entirely mine in the way people talked about it. It had become part of the family's shared safety net. And in their minds, I was the one responsible for holding that net open. The quiet daughter. The responsible one. The one who would understand. For years, that role had felt almost natural. But that night, after the call ended, I sat in the silence of my studio for a long time. Because for the first time, I realized something important. Everyone in my family knew exactly who they expected me to be. The only person who had never actually agreed to that role was me. The moment everything changed wasn't loud. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic realization. Just a quiet afternoon and a small piece of information delivered casually, the way life-altering things sometimes are. It happened on a Thursday. I remember the day clearly because I had just finished a long project that had taken nearly 3 weeks to complete. A developer in Seattle had hired me to illustrate a set of residential buildings, and that morning I had finally sent the final files. Whenever I finished a big project, I usually gave myself a few hours off before starting the next one. That afternoon, I made tea, sat on the back steps of the house, and opened my sketchbook. The yard behind my house is small but peaceful. A narrow maple tree leans slightly toward the fence, and in early spring, the branches fill with soft green leaves that move constantly in the wind. I was sketching the tree when my phone buzzed. A message from my mother. It wasn't unusual for her to text during the day, so I opened it without thinking. The message was short. Ryan will be by later to look at the basement. I told him it should work perfectly. For a few seconds, I simply stared at the screen. Not because the words were confusing, because they were so clear. Ryan will be by later. I told him it should work perfectly. There was no question in the message. No, would that be okay? No, what do you think? Just a statement. A decision already made. The strange part is that my first reaction wasn't anger. It was something quieter, a kind of stillness. The same stillness that happens when you suddenly see the full structure of a drawing after studying it for hours, when all the lines finally make sense at once. Every small conversation over the past few weeks rearranged itself in my mind. The casual question about the basement, the dinner comment at the restaurant, the repeated phrases about extra space, Ryan's joking comment about crashing there. None of those moments had been random. They had taken steps, a slow progression toward a conclusion that everyone else had apparently reached already. I closed the message and placed the phone on the step beside me. For a long time, I just sat there listening to the wind moving through the leaves. It would have been easy to respond immediately. I could have texted back something simple. Mom, you should have asked me first. Or even more direct. No, that's not happening. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed very still and thought about something my job had taught me over the years. When you're drawing architecture, rushing to correct a mistake can make the structure worse. If a line is wrong, you don't erase it immediately. You study the drawing first. You figure out why the mistake happened. You understand the whole structure before you change anything. So that's what I did. I looked at the situation the way I would look at a blueprint. My mother believed she could offer my basement apartment to Ryan without asking me. Ryan believed he could show up and look at the space, as if the decision were already underway. Neither of them had spoken to me directly about it, which meant something important had already happened long before that text message. They had assumed my answer. And assumptions like that don't appear overnight. They grow slowly, from years of someone behaving in predictable ways. The quiet daughter. The responsible one. The one who wouldn't make things difficult. For the first time in a long while, I asked myself a very simple question. What would happen if I stopped being predictable? The answer didn't arrive right away. But something inside me shifted that afternoon. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. For years, my silence had been automatic, a habit formed from avoiding unnecessary conflict. But now I realized something different. Silence could also be intentional, strategic, a choice. And that was the moment I stopped seeing myself as the person in the family who simply reacted to situations. From that day forward, I would be the one deciding how the story unfolded, even if no one else realized it yet. Ryan arrived that evening around 6. I heard his car before I saw it. The uneven hum of an engine that had probably missed a few scheduled oil changes. He pulled up along the curb in front of the house the way he always did when visiting, slightly crooked, tires brushing the edge of the bike lane. From the window of my studio, I watched him step out. Same restless energy, same hurried movements. For a moment, I considered going downstairs immediately, meeting him at the door and asking the obvious question, "Why are you here?" But instead I stayed where I was, not hiding, observing. Ryan walked up the front path and knocked once before letting himself in. My family had always treated my house that way, more like a familiar place than someone else's property. "Hey!" he called as he stepped inside. "In the studio," I answered. His footsteps climbed the stairs quickly. When he appeared in the doorway, he looked exactly the same as he always had. Slightly wind-blown hair, a jacket half-zipped, the faint expression of someone moving through life a little faster than the ground beneath him. "Hey, Pop!" he said with a quick smile. That was his nickname for me, short for Poppy. "Hey!" He glanced around the room briefly, then rubbed the back of his neck in a gesture I'd seen countless times before. "So, Mum said I could check out the basement." There it was. Not a request. A reference to something already granted. I studied his face for a moment. Ryan didn't look manipulative, he looked comfortable. Comfortable in the assumption that everything was already arranged. And in a strange way, that made sense. My mother had probably spoken to him with complete confidence. In her mind, there was no reason I would object. Why would I? The quiet daughter. The responsible one. The one who understood. For a moment, I considered correcting the situation right there. A simple sentence would have done it. Mum didn't ask me. But instead, I said something else. "You can take a look if you want." Ryan's shoulders relaxed instantly. "Thanks," he said, already turning toward the stairs. As he walked down toward the basement, I followed at a slower pace. The apartment was exactly the way I had left it weeks earlier. Clean counters, empty refrigerator, the small couch facing the window. Ryan stepped inside and looked around. "This is actually really nice," he said. His tone carried mild surprise, as if he had expected something smaller. "It's comfortable," I said. He walked through the kitchen area, opened a cabinet, and glanced toward the bedroom door. Honestly, this would solve a lot of problems for me right now. Again, not a question, just a statement of convenience. I leaned lightly against the wall near the entrance. "How long are you thinking?" I asked. Ryan shrugged. "Just until I figure things out." That phrase, I had heard it so many times over the years that it almost sounded rehearsed. Just until I figure things out. It could mean a month or a year. Ryan walked over to the window and looked out toward the small side yard. "I mean, it's perfect," he said. "Separate entrance and everything." Then he turned back toward me with an easy smile. "Mum said you'd probably be fine with it." There was no tension in his voice, no hesitation, just certainty. And that was the moment my silence became something different. Up until now, silence had been my habit. From this point forward, it became a decision. I nodded slightly. "We'll talk about it," I said. Ryan didn't seem to notice the wording. To him, the visit had already confirmed what he believed was inevitable. But as we walked back upstairs, I realized something important. Everyone in my family thought they understood how I handled situations like this. They believed they could predict my response. And they were right, just not in the way they expected. Because silence, when chosen carefully, can reveal far more than confrontation ever does. And in the days that followed, I began paying closer attention than anyone realized. Ryan didn't move in that night. Not officially, but something else happened that was just as revealing. 2 days later, my mother called again. Her voice carried the relaxed tone of someone who believed a situation had already been resolved. "So," she said warmly, "Ryan told me the basement looks great." I was sitting at my desk when she said it, reviewing some emails from a client. "Did he?" I replied. "Yes," she said. "He sounded really relieved. I think it's exactly what he needs right now." I noticed the phrasing immediately. Not what he asked for, what he needs. Need is a powerful word in families. Once something is framed as a need, resistance starts to feel like cruelty. I stayed quiet for a moment. My mother interpreted that silence the way she always had. Agreement. "It's just temporary," she continued gently, "until he gets back on his feet." There was that phrase again. Temporary. Back on his feet. Words that sounded responsible, but carried no actual timeline. "How long do you think that might be?" I asked calmly. "Oh, not long," she said quickly. "Just until he sorts things out." The conversation drifted after that. She talked about a neighbour's garden, about a television show she'd been watching. Eventually, we said goodbye the same way we always did. But after the call ended, I didn't return to my work. Instead, I opened my laptop and began doing something my family had never really noticed about me. Research. Architectural illustration had trained me to pay attention to details that others ignored. Contracts, zoning documents, permits, property descriptions, those things appeared constantly in my professional life. I understood the paperwork. More importantly, I understood how often people made assumptions about it without actually reading it. The first thing I reviewed was my own property file. Every document from the purchase 8 years earlier was still carefully organized in a digital folder. Deed, mortgage agreement, title insurance, property boundaries. All of it confirmed what I already knew. The house, including the basement apartment, was entirely in my name. No shared ownership, no family investment, no hidden claims. Legally speaking, the property belonged to exactly one person, me. But ownership is only one part of a situation like this. The second part is expectation. And expectations can quietly change the meaning of ownership if you're not careful. So I started paying attention to something else. Patterns. Over the next week, Ryan mentioned the basement casually in conversation several times. Once in a text message, "Thinking about moving some boxes over this weekend." Another time during a phone call, "I might bring a few things by just to see how they fit." Every message carried the same assumption. The move was already happening. None of them asked. Meanwhile, my mother spoke about the situation with increasing confidence. "I'm so glad you two can help each other like this." The wording fascinated me. Not Ryan helping himself. Not Ryan asking. Family helping family. The phrase sounded generous. But it also did something subtle. It reframed my property as a shared resource. And the interesting part was that everyone seemed completely comfortable with that idea. Except. So instead of arguing about it, I began preparing, quietly, the same way I approach complicated drawing projects. First, I made a list. What would happen if Ryan moved into the basement indefinitely? Utilities, insurance, maintenance, liability. The more I wrote down, the clearer something became. This wasn't just a favor. It was an arrangement with real consequences. Then I began documenting small things. Not secretly, just carefully. Dates of conversations, messages, assumptions that were spoken out loud. None of it felt dramatic. It simply felt organized. In architecture, stability comes from understanding how every part of a structure connects to the others. And families are structures too. For years, my role in that structure had been simple. Support, reliability, accommodation. But now I was looking at the design differently. Because the one thing my family had never really noticed about me was how comfortable I was with long timelines. Patience is a strange kind of leverage, especially when everyone else believes nothing is happening. And while Ryan and my mother were busy planning his move, I was quietly learning something they had never expected. The structure of the situation wasn't nearly as simple as they thought. About 10 days after Ryan first came to look at the basement, something happened that clarified the situation completely. It was a small discovery, the kind of thing most people might overlook. But for me, it changed everything. The morning started like any other. I was sitting at my desk with my sketchbook open, reviewing notes for a new project. Outside, the street was quiet except for the occasional bicycle passing the window. My phone buzzed with a message from Ryan. Dropped a couple of boxes by the basement door. Hope that's cool. I paused for a moment. Not because the message surprised, but because of the phrasing again. Hope that's cool. Not is that okay? Can I bring some things over? The boxes had already been delivered. The decision had already been made. I closed my laptop and walked downstairs. Outside, near the side gate that led to the basement entrance, 2 medium-sized moving boxes sat neatly stacked against the wall. Ryan hadn't rung the doorbell. He hadn't called. He had simply arrived, left part of his belongings and driven away. To him, the space was already becoming his. I stood there for a minute looking at the boxes. They weren't heavy, just ordinary cardboard with black marker labels. Clothes, kitchen. It would have been easy to text him right then. Come get your things. That would have been the simplest response. But simplicity doesn't always reveal the truth of a situation. Instead, I carried the boxes inside the basement apartment and placed them gently in the corner of the living room. Then I did something else. I sat down at the small kitchen table and opened my notebook. Over the past week, I had been documenting conversations and timelines quietly. Not because I expected conflict, but because clarity often comes from seeing events written out in order. And when I looked at the list that morning, something became obvious. Ryan hadn't asked permission to move in. My mother hadn't asked either. But they had both acted as if permission already existed. That assumption had become the entire foundation of the situation. And foundations matter. Because if the base of something is incorrect, everything built on top of it eventually becomes unstable. I thought about the way my mother had framed the situation. Family helping family. It sounded generous. But generosity requires choice. And no one had given me one. For the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to imagine the situation from an outside perspective. If this were happening to a friend, what would it look like? A sibling moving belongings into someone else's property without a clear agreement. A parent is encouraging it without consulting the homeowner. When you remove the emotional language, the structure becomes very clear. Someone had decided to use something that didn't belong to them, and they had relied on a single assumption to make it work. That I wouldn't challenge it. I closed the notebook and looked around the small apartment. The room was still quiet, still empty except for the 2 boxes. But something had changed in my understanding of the situation. Up until now, I had been thinking about it like a family disagreement, a misunderstanding. But it wasn't that. It was a test. Not an intentional one, just the natural result of years of predictable behavior. Everyone involved believed they already knew my response. And that belief had given them confidence. Confidence is powerful, but misplaced confidence is even more powerful. Because it leaves people completely unprepared for the moment they're wrong. I didn't feel angry sitting there. If anything, I felt calm, clear. Because that morning, I realized something important. The leverage in this situation didn't come from confrontation. It came from timing, from understanding exactly when to act. And most importantly, from letting everyone else continue believing the story they had already created. For now, the boxes stayed where they were. Ryan would probably bring more soon. My mother would likely continue speaking about the arrangement as if it was settled, and I would keep listening, because the clearer their assumptions became, the easier it would be to decide what to do next. A few days after the boxes appeared, Ryan came back. This time he knocked. Not loudly. Just 2 quick taps on the door before letting himself in the way he always had. I was in the kitchen making coffee when he walked in. "Hey," he said casually, dropping his keys onto the counter like he had done 100 times before. "Hey!" He glanced toward the hallway that led to the basement stairs. "Those boxes okay down there?" "They're fine." "Fine," I said. He nodded, relieved, then leaned against the counter. "I've got a couple more things in the car." Again, not a question, just another step in the process that, in his mind, had already been approved. I watched him for a moment while the coffee machine hummed quietly behind me. Ryan wasn't acting aggressively. He wasn't trying to take advantage of me in the way people imagine when they hear stories like this. He was simply moving forward with something he believed had already been decided. And the reason he believed that was simple, because everyone around him had always told the same story about me. Poppy will understand. Poppy always helps. Poppy won't make things complicated. Standing there in the kitchen, I realized something important. There were several different ways this situation could unfold. The first option was confrontation. I could stop him right there and say the words that had never been said. "Ryan, you never asked if you could live here." It would be direct, clear, but it would also create something my family had never handled well: conflict. My mother would likely become upset. Ryan would feel embarrassed or defensive. The situation would turn into an emotional argument about loyalty and support. And once something becomes emotional, it's very difficult to keep it fair. The second option was avoidance. I could let him move in temporarily and deal with the consequences later. Many people do this. They tell themselves it's easier to say yes now and fix things later. But temporary arrangements have a strange way of becoming permanent when no clear boundaries exist. I had seen that happen too many times in other families. Then there was the third option, the irreversible one. Not dramatic, not loud, just decisive. Instead of reacting to what my family expected, I could change the structure of the situation entirely. Architects sometimes do something similar when a building plan becomes unstable. Instead of adjusting small details, they redesign the foundation so the entire structure works differently. The thought appeared quietly in my mind. If the basement apartment was the center of this situation, then maybe the answer wasn't about whether Ryan could live there. Maybe it was about what the space represented in the first place. While I stood there thinking, Ryan walked to the door. "I'll grab the other boxes," he said. "Okay," I replied. He stepped outside, leaving the door slightly open. I stayed in the kitchen, listening to the sound of his car trunk opening. That was the moment I made the decision. Not emotionally, calmly. I knew exactly what I needed to do. Not to punish anyone. Not to prove a point. Simply to restore the one thing that had quietly disappeared from the entire conversation. Choice. Because until that moment, everyone had been acting as if my answer was already known. But once the decision I was about to make was in motion, the situation would no longer depend on anyone's assumptions. Not my mother's. Not Ryan's. And not even mine. When Ryan came back inside carrying another box, I smiled slightly and stepped aside so he could pass. "Thanks for letting me sort this out here," he said. "You're welcome," I replied. And in a way I meant it, because by the time he finished bringing his things downstairs, the decision that would change everything had already been made. He just didn't know it yet. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Not because I was anxious, because clarity has a strange way of sharpening your sense of direction. When I walked downstairs, the house was quiet. The street outside still held that pale grey light that appears before the city fully wakes up. Ryan's boxes were still in the basement apartment. 3 of them now: clothes, kitchen, books. He had stacked them neatly against the wall, as if he expected to return later and continue settling in. I stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the small room. Nothing about it had changed yet, but I knew something important already had. The decision I made the night before wasn't complicated. In fact, the solution had been sitting quietly in front of me for years. The basement apartment had always been a separate unit, separate entrance, separate living space, which meant it had always had another purpose. Not just as an extra room for the family, but as something else entirely. A rental. For most of the years I owned the house, I had treated it casually, renting it occasionally when I felt like it, leaving it empty when I preferred the quiet. But now I looked at it differently, not emotionally. Structurally, the assumption that Ryan could move in depended on one silent condition: that the space was available, so the simplest way to change the entire situation was equally quiet. Make it unavailable. That morning, I sat down at my desk and began taking a few practical steps. First, I contacted a small property management service that several neighbors had recommended over the years. I had never used them before because I enjoyed handling rentals myself. But this time, I wanted everything handled professionally, by someone outside the family. The conversation was straightforward. Yes, the woman on the phone said. We can list the unit quickly if it's ready. I replied. Great! We'll need photos and a quick walkthrough for the listing. Today works. Next, I reviewed the rental guidelines for my area. Something I was already familiar with but wanted to confirm. Short-term agreements, deposit structure, tenant protections. Everything was clear. Everything was legal. Most importantly, once a lease existed, the basement apartment would no longer be an empty family resource. It would be someone's home. And that would change the entire conversation. Later that afternoon, a representative from the property service arrived to photograph the space. Ryan wasn't there when she came. The timing worked that way naturally. As she walked through the apartment, she nodded approvingly. "This will rent quickly," she said. That's what I thought. She took photos of the living room, the kitchen, and the bedroom. The whole process took less than 30 minutes. By the time she left, the listing was already scheduled to go live that evening. And then I did something that probably would have surprised my family the most. Nothing. I didn't announce my plan. I didn't call Ryan. I didn't message my mother. Because there was nothing to argue about. No confrontation needed. The apartment simply became what it had always technically been. A rental unit. Ryan's boxes remained downstairs exactly where he had left them. But now they were sitting in a space that was actively being offered to other people. The interesting thing about structural decisions is that once they're set in motion, they tend to resolve situations naturally. No raised voices required, just time. And as the listing went live that evening, I realized something almost peaceful about the entire process. For years, everyone had assumed I would respond to pressure. But I wasn't responding to pressure at all. I was simply making a decision about my own property, quietly. In the same way, I had bought the house. The same way I had managed it for 8 years. The same way I handled every other important part of my life. And somewhere in the city that night, people began seeing the listing for a small, comfortable basement apartment in a quiet Portland neighborhood, which meant something else was about to happen. Very soon, the assumptions my family had built this entire situation on would meet reality. The listing went live on a Friday evening. By Saturday morning, there were already 4 inquiries. That didn't surprise me. Rental units in Portland tend to move quickly, especially ones with a private entrance and a quiet neighborhood. Still, the speed of it created a strange contrast with what was happening in my own house. Because while strangers online were beginning to ask about the apartment professionally, Ryan was continuing to treat it as if it were already his. Late Saturday afternoon, he stopped by again. I heard the familiar sound of his car outside and the trunk closing a few moments later. This time, he carried 2 more boxes down to the basement before even saying hello. By the time he came upstairs, he looked satisfied. "Almost got everything moved out of my old place," he said, brushing dust from his hands. I leaned against the kitchen counter, watching him calmly. "That was quick." "Yeah," he said with a shrug. "Figured it was easier to just start bringing stuff over." There it was again, the same quiet certainty. Not arrogance, just complete confidence that the arrangement existed. Ryan grabbed a glass from the cabinet and filled it with water. "You know," he said casually, "this might actually work out really well for both of us." "How so?" I asked. "Well," he said, taking a sip, "you've got the extra space anyway, and I can help out around here if you need anything." The offer sounded generous, but it also revealed something important. In Ryan's mind, the basement apartment was already mine to give, and his to accept. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed softly on the counter beside me. Another message from the property service. 2 more viewing requests. I glanced at the screen briefly, then set the phone down. Ryan didn't notice. He was already talking about where he might set up his desk downstairs. "The lighting's actually pretty good in that living room," he said. "Could make a decent workspace." I nodded slightly. "It is," he smiled, clearly pleased with the situation. "Honestly, this takes a lot of the pressure off right now." Then he clapped his hands lightly together. "I'll finish moving the rest tomorrow." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out the kitchen window for a moment. The street was quiet. A couple of neighbors walked their dog past the house. Inside, everything felt almost normal, except for one quiet detail. Ryan had no idea that the basement apartment already had 5 people scheduled to see it in the next 48 hours. Later that evening, my mother called. Her voice carried the same relieved warmth I had heard earlier that week. "I spoke to Ryan today," she said. "Did you?" "Yes," she said happily. "He sounds so much calmer now that he's getting settled." Settled, another word that carried quite finality. "I'm glad he feels better," I replied. "I just knew this would work out," she continued. "Family supporting each other. That's what matters." I listened without interrupting. On the other end of the phone, my mother sounded proud, relieved, as if a problem had been solved through kindness and cooperation. And in a way, she was right. A solution was already unfolding, just not the one she imagined. By Sunday afternoon, the property service had confirmed something else. A young teacher named Daniel had already submitted a rental application after viewing the listing online. His job was stable, his references were excellent, and he needed to move within the next 2 weeks. The apartment, in other words, was exactly what he had been looking for. When the representative called to tell me, I simply asked one question. "When can he view the unit?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "That works." After the call ended, I sat quietly at the kitchen table for a while. Upstairs, the house was calm. Downstairs, Ryan's boxes were still stacked in the corner of the living room. And somewhere in the city, someone else was preparing to see what they believed might become their next home. The interesting thing about consequences is that they rarely arrive with dramatic announcements. Most of the time, they begin quietly, like a door opening, or a listing going live, or a stranger scheduling a viewing for a space someone else already thought they owned. Daniel arrived the next morning at 10. He was exactly on time. I had always appreciated that quality in people, the quiet reliability of someone who respects a schedule. When I opened the front door, he stood on the porch holding a small folder. "Hi, I'm Daniel," he said politely. "Poppy," I replied. "Come in." He was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with the calm, slightly tired expression of someone who spends most of their days in a classroom. "The listing looked great," he said as he stepped inside. "I'm glad." I led him through the side gate toward the basement entrance. Inside, the apartment looked exactly the way it had the day Ryan first visited, except for one detail. The boxes. 3 of them still sat neatly in the corner of the living room. Daniel noticed them immediately, but didn't seem alarmed. "Previous tenant moving out? Move out?" he asked. "Something like that," I said calmly. He nodded, accepting the answer easily. As we walked through the apartment, he asked practical questions. Utilities, parking, lease length. Everything about his approach was straightforward and thoughtful. At one point, he stood near the window, looking out toward the small side yard. "This is exactly the kind of place I've been hoping to find," he said. I could hear the quiet relief in his voice. Housing in the city had been difficult for him, too. After about 15 minutes, he closed the folder he'd been carrying. "If everything works on your end," he said, "I'd really like to move forward." I nodded. "It does." By the time he left, the decision had effectively been made. The property service finalized the paperwork that afternoon. A standard 1-year lease. Deposit submitted, move-in scheduled for the 1st of the following month. It was all completely normal, professional, legal, and most importantly, final. The basement apartment was no longer an empty space. It was someone else's home. That evening, Ryan arrived again. This time, he looked a little more relaxed than usual. "Got the last few things," he said, carrying another box toward the basement stairs. I followed him down quietly. When he stepped into the living room, he placed the new box beside the others and stretched his arms. "All right," he said, "almost fully moved in." Then he noticed something, the small information packet that the property service had left on the kitchen counter earlier that day. He picked it up. "What's this?" I leaned against the doorway. "Rental paperwork." Ryan frowned slightly as he flipped through the pages. "Rental?" Then he stopped. His eyes moved quickly across the first page. The lease agreement, the property address, the signature lines. "Wait," he said slowly. He looked up at me, confusion spreading across his face. "What is this?" "The apartment has been rented," I said calmly. For a moment, he just stared at me, not angry, not even upset yet, just trying to process the sentence. "Rented to who?" "A teacher named Daniel. He'll be moving in next month." The room went very quiet. Ryan glanced around the apartment, at the couch, the kitchen, the boxes he had been slowly filling the room with over the past week. "Bo," he said, struggling to finish the thought. I thought, Mum said. He didn't finish the sentence, because somewhere in the middle of it, he realized something important. No one had ever actually asked me. He ran a hand through his hair, looking suddenly uncertain. So, what about my stuff? You can take it with you today, I said gently. Another long pause. This one is heavier than the others. I already moved out of my place, he said quietly. I know. That realization settled over him slowly. The plan he thought was secure had never actually existed. And the moment he understood that, something else became clear too. There was nothing left to negotiate. The lease had been signed. The apartment was no longer available. Ryan looked at the boxes again, then back at me. Why didn't you say something earlier? He asked. His voice wasn't angry, just confused. I met his eyes calmly. Because no one asked. And in that moment, the entire situation finally revealed itself for what it had always been. Not a misunderstanding, just an assumption that had lasted one step too long. Ryan didn't speak for several seconds after I answered. The room felt strangely still, as if the walls themselves were waiting to see what would happen next. He looked down at the lease papers again, then back at the boxes. For the first time since all of this had started, his confidence was gone. Not replaced with anger, just uncertainty. I thought, he began, then stopped. The sentence didn't finish, because he didn't really have a place to take it. I thought Mum handled it. I thought you wouldn't mind. I thought it was obvious. None of those statements could actually stand on their own. Finally, he exhaled slowly. So the places are really rented? Yes. When does the guy move in? Next month. Ryan nodded slightly, absorbing that. He walked over to one of the boxes and rested his hand on the top. I already gave notice on my old apartment, he said quietly. I figured, I replied. He looked up at me then, studying my face the way people do when they're trying to understand a decision that doesn't match their expectations. You could have just told me no. His voice wasn't accusing. If anything, it sounded almost tired. I thought about that for a moment. You never asked? I said again gently. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked around the room slowly. The small kitchen, the window, the couch, the place he had already begun imagining as his. Then he nodded once, a small acknowledgement. Upstairs, my phone buzzed. A moment later, it buzzed again. Ryan glanced toward the ceiling. Mum? He asked. Probably. He rubbed his face with both hands and laughed softly under his breath. She's going to lose her mind. Maybe, I said. He looked at me again, searching for some sign of anger or satisfaction. But there wasn't any. I wasn't trying to win anything. I was simply standing inside the reality of a decision I had made. Ryan seemed to realize that. Did you plan this the whole time? He asked. Not at first, but eventually. Yes. Another quiet pause. He nodded again, slower this time. Fair enough. Then he lifted one of the boxes. I guess I should start putting this stuff back in the car. You don't have to rush, I said. It's okay. He carried the box upstairs without another word. While he loaded the car, I sat at the kitchen table. A few minutes later, my phone rang. My mother's name appeared on the screen. I answered. Poppy, she said immediately, her voice tense. Ryan just told me what you did. I rented the apartment. Why would you do that? She asked. Not angry, confused. The same confusion Ryan had shown downstairs. I own the house, I said calmly. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. But he needed somewhere to stay, she said finally. I know. You could have helped him. I could have. The words hung there between us. My mother wasn't used to hearing sentences like that from me. For years, I had always been the person who made things easier. But easier for whom? That was the part we had never discussed. Poppy, she said slowly, this is family. Yes, and families help each other. I thought about the phrase she had used so many times over the past few weeks. Family helping family. You're right, I said. Then I added something quietly. But help usually starts with asking. On the other end of the phone, my mother didn't speak. Downstairs, Ryan's car door closed. The engine started. And for the first time since all of this began, the house returned to exactly what it had been before. Quiet. The house felt different after Ryan left. Not because anything physical had changed. The furniture was the same. The kitchen looked the same. The quiet afternoon light still fell across the floor exactly the way it always had. But something inside the structure of my life had shifted. For years, I had been the person who prevented uncomfortable moments, the one who smoothed things over, the one who quietly adjusted her own boundaries so other people wouldn't have to confront theirs. That role had never been officially assigned, but it had been understood. And the interesting thing about roles like that is how invisible they become. Not just to others, but to the person playing them. After Ryan drove away that afternoon, I stood for a while near the front window watching the street. Eventually, my phone buzzed with a message from him. Found a place to crash with a friend for now. I'll figure something out. I read the message twice before replying. I'm glad you have somewhere for the moment. A minute later, another message appeared. I should have talked to you directly. That's on me. I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back. We'll both remember next time. That was the last message we exchanged that day. My mother didn't call again that evening. I imagined she needed time to process what had happened. Not because I had done something dramatic, but because I had done something unfamiliar. I had chosen not to fulfill the role everyone expected. And when someone steps outside a long-standing pattern, it creates a strange kind of silence while everyone adjusts. Over the next few weeks, life returned to its usual rhythm. Work projects continued. Clients sent new requests. The maple tree in the backyard grew thicker with leaves as spring moved towards summer. And eventually, Daniel moved into the basement apartment exactly as planned. He turned out to be a quiet tenant. The kind you barely notice except for the occasional sound of footsteps on the stairs or a bicycle leaning against the side gate. Sometimes we passed each other outside. Morning, he'd say. Morning. Simple, easy, professional. My relationship with my family changed too. Not dramatically, but subtly. Ryan stopped assuming things when we talked. My mother became more careful with the way she framed requests. At first, the conversations felt slightly awkward, the way a room feels when furniture has been rearranged. But over time, something healthier replaced the old pattern: clarity. Because once people realize you have boundaries, they start asking where those boundaries are. And asking, as it turns out, is a very different dynamic than assuming. The truth is, I don't feel angry about what happened. Not with Ryan. Not with my mother. They acted based on the story they had known for years. A story where I was the dependable daughter who would quietly make space whenever someone else needed it. For a long time, that story had been accurate. Until it wasn't. And the person I am now isn't someone new or hardened or bitter. I'm still quiet. Still patient. Still, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks. The difference is that now, when people look at me and think they understand the role I'll play in their plans, I make sure they ask first. When people hear a story like this, they sometimes expect a dramatic ending, a big argument, a permanent family divide, some kind of emotional victory where one side wins. But that's not really how most real-life stories end. Life usually settles into something quieter. Ryan eventually found another apartment a few months later, a small place across town that suited him better than the basement ever would have. We still talk. Sometimes he even jokes about the whole situation now. My mother needed a little longer to adjust. For years, she had believed something very simple about me, that I would always step forward whenever someone in the family needed something. That belief didn't come from cruelty. It came from history, because for most of my life, I had been that person. But the older I get, the more I understand something important about relationships. Helping someone is meaningful when it's a choice. When it stops being a choice, it slowly becomes an expectation. And expectations have a strange way of erasing the person they depend on. The real change in this story wasn't renting the basement apartment. The real change was much smaller. It was the moment I realized that being calm and patient doesn't mean being endlessly available. You can still care about people. You can still support your family. You can still be the steady one in the room. But that doesn't mean you have to let other people write the rules for your life. For a long time, my silence made people believe they already knew my answer. Now my silence means something different. It means I'm thinking. And if someone wants something from me, they know the simple step that comes first. They ask. The funny thing is, once that change happens, relationships often become healthier, not worse. Because respect grows best in places where assumptions used to live. So that's my story. Not a dramatic one, just a quiet moment when a role that had existed for years finally changed. And I'm curious about something now. Have you ever been placed into a role inside your family or your workplace? The responsible one, the fixer, the person everyone assumes will say yes? And if you have, What was the moment you realized you were allowed to step outside that role? I'd really like to hear your thoughts.